interesting because in this chapter, there's really no give or take in dialogue. Um, there is so the main character and MacDonald are observing this conversation that a she-bright spirit has with another woman. And the she-bright spirit says no more than 10 words throughout the entire chapter. I'm guessing here, and this is just my guess, is that Lewis has written into this chapter something that he has seen firsthand in his life, that he saw something that was this tragic, and it made such an impression upon him that he wrote it in. And so there are two passages of scripture, and there are probably more that you might be able to think of that would be appropriate in terms of describing the theme or the kind of person that's in this chapter. But these are brutal passages, and so and they're brutal because this person is brutal. She just is. So the first is Proverbs 14:12, which says, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And then the second one is this, and this is just really, harsh, but it's true. Like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. Like a dog who returns to his vomit is a fool who returns to his folly. And so, as you'll see, this person, I think, fits these descriptions that I've given to you from these particular passages. And these people exist. I mean, it's not like they don't exist. They exist. We probably know some people like this. Not exactly like her, but a person who needs to control like this person does. So I'll read this through and then maybe have some questions and a few comments, maybe some points of application for it. So then Lewis writes, "This conversation also we heard. That is quite out of the question," said a female ghost to the one bright woman. "I should not dream of staying. If I am expected to meet Robert, I am ready to forgive him, of course, but anything more is quite impossible. How he comes to be here. But that's your affair." "But if you haven't forgiven him," said the other. "Surely I forgive him as a Christian," said the ghost. "But there are some things one can never forget." "But I don't understand," began the she spirit. "Exactly," said the ghost with a little laugh. "You never did. You always thought Robert could do no wrong. I know. Please don't interrupt me for one moment. You haven't the faintest conception of what I went through with your dear Robert. The ingratitude. It was I who made a man of him, sacrificed my whole life to him. And what was my reward? Absolute, utter selfishness. No, but listen, he was pottering along on about 600 a year when I married him. And mark my words, Hilda, he'd have been in that position today, he would have been in that position to the day of his death if it hadn't been for me. It was I who had to drive him every step of the way. He hadn't a spark of ambition. It was like trying to lift a sack of coal. I had to positively nag him to take on that extra work in the other department, though it was really the beginning of everything for him. The laziness of men. He said, if you please, he couldn't work more than 13 hours a day, as if I weren't working far longer. For my day's work wasn't over when his was. I had to keep him going all evening, if you'd understand what I mean. But if he'd had his way, he'd have just sat in an armchair and sulked when dinner was over. It was I who had to draw him out of himself and brighten him up and make conversation, with no help from him, of course. Sometimes he didn't even listen. As I said to him, I should have thought good manners, if nothing else. He seemed to have forgotten that I was a lady, even if I had married him, and all the time I was working my fingers to the bone for him, and without the slightest appreciation. I used to spend simply hours arranging flowers to make that poky little house nice. Instead of thinking of me, what do you think he said? He said he wished I wouldn't fill up the writing desk with them when he wanted to use it. And there was that perfectly frightful fuss one evening because I spilled one of the vases over some papers of his. It was all nonsense, really, because they weren't anything to do with his work. He's some silly idea of writing a book in those days, as if he could. I cured him of that in the end. No, Hilda, you must listen to me. The trouble I went to for entertaining. Robert's idea was that he'd just slink off by himself every now and then to see what he called his old friends and leave me to amuse myself. But I knew from the first that those friends were doing him no good. No, Robert, said I, your friends are now mine. It is my duty to have them here, however tired I am and however little we can afford it. You'd have thought that would have been enough. But they did come for a bit. That is where I had to use a certain amount of tact. A woman who has her wits about her can always drop in a word here and there. I wanted Robert to see them against a different background. They weren't quite at their ease somehow in my drawing room, not at their best. I couldn't help laughing sometimes. Of course, Robert was uncomfortable while the treatment was going on, but it was all for his own good in the end. None of that set were friends of his any longer by the end of the first year. And then he got a new job, a great step up. But what do you think? Instead of realizing that we now had a chance to spread out a little bit, all he said was, well, now, for God's sake, let me have some peace. That nearly finished me. I nearly gave him up altogether. But I knew my duty. I have always done my duty. You can't believe the work I had getting him to agree to a bigger house, and then finding a house. I wouldn't have grudged it one scrap if only he had taken in the right spirit, if only he had seen the fun of it all. If he had been a different sort of man, it would have been fun meeting him on the doorstep as he came back from the office saying, come along, Bobs, no time for dinner tonight. I've just heard of a house near the Watford, and I've got keys, and we can get there and be back by 1 o'clock. But with him, it was perfect misery, Hilda. For by this time, your wonderful Robert was turning into the sort of man who cares nothing but food, who cares nothing about but food. Well, I got him into that new house at last. Yes, I know. It was a little more than we could really afford at the moment, but all sorts of things are opening up before him. And of course, I began to entertain properly. No more of his sort of friends, thank you. I was doing it all for his sake. Every useful friend he ever made was due to me. Naturally, I had to dress well. They ought to have been the happiest years of both our lives. If they weren't, he had no one but himself to thank. Oh, he was a maddening man, simply maddening. He just set himself to get old and silent and grumpy, just sank into himself. He could have looked years younger had he taken the trouble. He needn't have walked with a stoop. I'm sure I warned him about that often enough. He was the most miserable host. Whenever we gave a party, everything rested on my shoulders. Robert was simply a wet blanket. As I said to him, and if I have said it once, I've said it 100 times, He hadn't always been like that. There had been that time when he took an interest in all sorts of things, and I had been quite ready to make friends. What on earth is coming over you? I used to say. Now he just didn't answer at all. He would sit, staring at me with his great big eyes. I came to hate a man with dark eyes, and I know it now, just hating me. That was my reward. After all I had done, sheer, wicked, senseless hatred, at the very moment when he was a richer man than he had ever dreamed of being. As I used to say to him, Robert, you're simply letting yourself go to seed. The younger men who came to the house, it wasn't my fault if they liked me better than my bear of a husband and used to laugh at him. I did my duty to the very end. I forced him to take exercise. That was really my chief reason for keeping up the Great Dane. I kept on giving parties. I took him for the most wonderful holidays. I saw that he didn't drink too much. Even when things became desperate, I encouraged him to take up his writing again. It couldn't do any harm by then. How could I help it if he did have a nervous breakdown in the end? My conscience is clear. I've done my duty by him, if ever a woman has. So you see why it would be impossible to, and yet I don't know. I believe I have changed my mind. I'll make them a fair offer, Hilda. I will not meet him if it means just meeting him and no more. But if I'm given a free hand, I'll take charge of him again. I will take up my burden once more. But I must have a free hand. With all the time one could have here, I believe I could still make him into something. Those are terrifying words. All the time that I have here, I believe I could still make him into something. Somewhere quiet to ourselves. Wouldn't that be a good plan? He's not fit to be on his own. Put me in charge of him as opposed to God. Put me in charge of him. He wants firm handling. I know him better than you do. What's that? No. Give him to me. Do you hear? Don't consult him. Just give him to me. I am his wife, aren't I? I was only beginning. There's lots of things I still want to do with him. No, listen, Hilda, please, I'm so miserable. I must have someone to do things to. It's simply frightful down there. No one minds me at all. I can't alter them. It's dreadful to see them all sitting about and not being able to do anything with them. Give him back to me. Why should he have everything his own way? It's not good for him. It isn't right. It's not fair. I want Robert. What right have you to keep me from him? I hate you. How can I pay him out if you won't let me have him? The ghost, which had towered up like a dying candle flame, snapped suddenly. A sour, dry smell lingered in the air for a moment, and there was no ghost to be seen. So here we have a person, and again, I just got to believe that Lewis is drawing upon an experience or somebody that he knew in his life that he observed that had that kind of an encounter, that kind of experience in his life. So I do want to say this, because this person in some ways is a caricature, and it and I think that maybe we all had a glimpse of that kind of a caricature, maybe in a woman, but those kinds of caricatures also exist in men. And so it would be interesting, wouldn't it, to see how Lewis might describe a man who wanted that kind of control over, say, his wife, and how that might unfold. And so if I were teaching a class and we were working through this book, I probably would want to give an assignment to my students and say, write a 500-page essay that describes a man who has, these kinds of inclinations where they are basically seeking total control of another person and attempting to live vicariously through that person for their own benefit. And that, it's not just the control, but the more pernicious thing about that, and about anybody who likes or wants to control in those kinds of ways, is that becomes their whole identity. That whole thing takes on a life of its own and is incredibly destructive, to themselves and to people around them. And so, there are those people out there that are pretty lonely because they have this penchant, this drive to control others. And so there'll be people who will have none of it. They won't position themselves so that that person can control them in the way they want to control those people, that person. And so, but occasionally that controlling person does find a victim, and that victim wants to be controlled. They're hardwired for it. And so that's when the whole thing begins. And, at least in my lifetime, there have been numerous times where I hit my head, think, why would you let a person do that to you? But that's what they do. So, you would think, and this is kind of Lewis's point here, that with her time on the edge of hell and now being exposed to heaven on its outer perimeter, that you would think that would arrest her thinking about how she sees herself and how she sees her purpose. But for her sole purpose in life was to control Robert. And that was it. And that she wanted godlike godlike control over him. It is interesting, isn't it, that like the antecedent of God having control over our lives. God has control over our lives, but he will not possess our lives so that we are puppets. That is not what he does. But in this case, this woman wanted to possess Robert's soul, the whole of his life. And why at some point Robert didn't stand up for himself, who knows? Sort of like those are the kinds of people you kind of hit your head and think, well, you got to defend yourself. You have to do something to help yourself to extricate yourself from those kinds of circumstances, because it's just incredibly unhealthy. Fortunately, in that chapter, it seems as if there were no children, and for whatever reason, but there didn't seem to be any children, so no one to pick up any bad habits and to carry on the tradition that she had started. So going back to Proverbs 14:12, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And so here's a person that, I guess you could say she was sincere. She was extraordinarily sincere, but you can be very sincere and still be wrong, terribly wrong. And so she was so consumed with what she believed to be the right way, that was so different from how God wanted her to love her husband, that she basically sent herself back to hell. I mean, she just exploded and went back to hell, probably never to come back again. So she just didn't get it. And so we live in a world where, we are surrounded by people who believe that the way that the path that they are pursuing is the right way, and they are sincere in that path. And sometimes we are taken in by that sincerity. We are moved by it, but it's still wrong, and it's still destructive, and it still not only harms them, but harms people around them. And so we have to find ways as Christians to live in response to that, to find ways to challenge people in their sincerity without appearing to be judgmental or hateful or any of those kinds of things. And then this other text, like a dog that returns to his vomit, so a fool who repeats his folly. And this is exactly what happened here. That she was so hell-bent, literally hell-bent, on taking control of Robert, that, the very thing that sent her to hell. So she, to borrow from, a concept from chapter 9, there's a difference between a person who grumbles and a person who becomes a grumble. There's a difference. There's a difference between a person who grumbles and a person who becomes a grumble, who becomes the personification of grumble. So, there are, to build on that for a moment or two, there are people who, what's the word I'm looking for? People who become curmudgeons. And so, a curmudgeon is just a person who grumbles, who doesn't see anything positive about life, and who has a dismal outlook and those kinds of things. And so there are people who begin their lives not being quite that, but being susceptible to that. And by the time they end their lives, they're just miserable people to be around. There isn't anything that's good. There's nothing. So it isn't right unless everything's wrong. That's how they are. That life isn't right unless everything is wrong. So for them, that's the highest value. Everything has to be wrong so they can grumble about it. That's a curmudgeon. This woman here, she became the personification of a nag, of a person who had to be in control of another person's life, and who had to live vicariously through that life. That Robert was merely an extension of her. That in the same way that she used her fingers or her hands or her feet, that's what Robert was too. He was just an extension of her. He was not allowed to have his own mind, his own beliefs, his own values, his own pleasures. He wasn't allowed to have any of that. It all had to be what she wanted it to be. And so the very thing that sent her to hell, this pathological need to control his life, she couldn't correct even in heaven. And in fact, double down on it. Here they are in heaven, and it's pretty clear that Robert's life would be better there, but she felt like she could improve upon his life in heaven. I mean, that's the height of arrogance, isn't it? And so she just repeated her folly. So, what she did to Robert, to use this metaphor, what she did to Robert on earth was to be vomit. Her work in his life was vomit. And when she tried to encounter him again in heaven, she wanted to return to that vomit, to the very thing that sent her to hell. She became the personification of that. So that's why it's important in our lives that we take account of prevailing sin. That when we have sin in our life, if we're not careful, that sin takes on a life of its own. And if that sin takes on a life of its own, that sin can become our life. And if that sin becomes our life, that sin can become us. And if that sin becomes us, Lewis suggests here, there is nothing left to redeem. There isn't anything, left of our humanity. And so that's why, It's important. And that's really, again, that's just one of the many disciplines that Lewis brings to this text as well as to the Screw Tape Letters, is this spiritual formation discipline that he layers much of his literature with. So just very profound in that regard. So this is the chapter. And, I would suggest that, some of the takeaways of this would be, are there ways in your life that you are absolutely convinced that you have defaulted to, that you believe to be true and right, but really are not that? And so, do we live our lives with enough kind of reflection that we can spot certain areas or portions of our lives that we live with being convinced this is the right way, but in reality, it's just really not. It's really destructive. And then are there those areas in our lives where we are tempted to return to our sin again and again and again, even though it's not good for us, even though it made us sick? Do we still go back to it? Even though it harms us, even though it's humiliated us, we find ourselves still going back to it. And that's what's happened with this woman here. Her narcissism, her self-love, her need for control, and how that need for control, she became the personification of it. Are there those things in our lives that we just don't live with the kind of reflection we ought to have? That there are certain dangers, certain kinds of sins that we allow to continue to reside, that if we're not careful, they could take over our lives and control us. And then we seek to control others through them. So I think those are some of the takeaways from this. And I hope that, it's in some ways, it's kind of more of a humorous, because it is a caricature of a person. Well, one final thing I do think that would be good too, is to, try to think of some examples of men who seek to control everything or a person in their life exhaustively. I think we all probably, without thinking too hard, could come up with someone like that. And if we've ever kind of fallen under their shadow, we know how miserable that can be. And why are they like that? Why is it that some people find it necessary? And I think I've known quite a few Christians for whom control was the primary way in which they went about their life and their work in ministry. And so because they were doing it in the name of Jesus, it was excused. But that's that logical fallacy, right? Does the end justify the means? Does the end, I'm doing this for Jesus, justify the means that I use too much control in order to get people to Jesus or get people to serve Jesus or whatever? I think I've seen that so many times in ministry. And those people are given a pass. And it's never been a good thing. So, all right. So I hope that's helpful to you. We will do chapter 11 next week as we make our way through this. And I think, let me see here. This is a chapter about a mother and her son. So you might find it to be interesting too. And there's some important themes in this chapter as well. So, all right, well, take care. You have a great day, and God bless. Bye-bye.